Welcome. My name is Gerald Eisman. I'm the director of the Institute for Civic and Community Engagement here at San Francisco State. And it is my great pleasure and privilege to host this evening's exciting event, a question and answer forum with former Secretary of Labor Robert Reich, who is now the Chancellor's Professor of Public Policy at the University of California. The program today is being sponsored by the American Democracy Project, an initiative of the American Association of State Colleges and Universities, along with its companion initiative, the Democracy Commitment, which is targeted toward community colleges to produce the next generation of engaged citizens, and the Inequality For All national campaign. I would now like to invite San Francisco State University President Leslie E. Wong to the podium to welcome our guest and the national audience. President Wong.
Thank you, Dr. Eisman. Again, welcome to our audience and to the virtual audience. Welcome to San Francisco State University. It is an honor to welcome former Secretary of Labor Robert Reich to San Francisco State. The relationship between educational opportunity and economic opportunity is very, very clear. In particular, at San Francisco State, we tend to speak of educational heritage as well. That is, when our first-gen students graduate, it is very, very likely that their siblings, their cousins, their aunties, their uncles, their mothers and fathers, their grandparents and their grandmothers are more likely to attend a college campus. The seeds of educational success and economic success in a family is sown by the success of the graduate who is a first-generation student. I am particularly proud of how San Francisco State succeeds with our students. This success of first-generation students is at the root of our commitment to social justice, and it is in that spirit that I welcome former Secretary of Labor Robert Reich to campus. Thank you, and welcome everyone.
Thank you, President Wong. I am told that we have approximately 200 universities nationwide streaming this event tonight, from the University of Alaska in Anchorage to Florida International University in Miami, from the University of Missouri in St. Louis to Murray Mac College in Massachusetts, to the University of Hawaii in Manoa. Throughout the nation, we have students concerned about the issues surrounding inequality, its causes, and its consequences. Welcome to today's forum. The forum is being recorded, and a fully captioned version will be available on YouTube in about a week's time. We are now ready to begin. I will invite our distinguished guest to provide an opening remark, which will then be followed by questions that were solicited from students from participating institutions throughout the country. You are encouraged to follow the event on Twitter, hashtag IFA on campus. Our moderator today is College of Business Associate Professor of Economics, Anashua Chowdhury. Professor Reich, some opening remarks. Thank you.
Well, first of all, let me thank San Francisco State University and thank all of you for joining me today, or if you are in a university where it's tonight, joining me tonight. I can't think of an issue that is more important for this country to tackle directly, that affects every single one of you, students, more importantly than widening inequality of income and wealth and of opportunity. There's much that can be done. You must not think that the game is over, the game is rigged, that there's nothing you can do about it. I know that there is much that can be done and should be done, and we will have an opportunity in the next half hour, I hope, to talk about what some of those ideas may be. It's not going to be easy. The movement, and we do need a political movement for shared prosperity in this country, is coming, but it will not come quickly. It will be the legacy of your generation. My generation tried. I think in many important respects we failed. We should have seen this coming, and we sort of did, but very little has been done to date. Political will is building for solutions, whether it be raising the minimum wage or controlling Wall Street with the resurrection of the Glass-Steagall Act, making sure that we have an economy that's working for everyone instead of a very small minority. But until we get that kind of economy, and until we get a democracy that is working for everyone, it's going to be very difficult for us all to move forward. I want this to be an uplifting half hour. I don't want you to leave here feeling that these problems are so large and so onerous that one individual or a small group of individuals can't make a difference. They can make a difference. In fact, we have no choice.
Professor
Questions?
Reich, thank you for being here. I truly believe you're pro-worker, and being a mother, a woman, and a full-time professional, I thank you for the Family Medical Leave Act, which I associate with you as much as President Clinton. That was a very important piece of legislation that passed during your time. And I know this will resonate with a lot of people here in this audience. I want to start with the film where you talk a little bit about regretting not doing some things during your time. What was your biggest regret?
Well, I think the biggest regret I have, and most people who serve at the highest reaches of our government and have the privilege of being in the cabinet, I think they would have to be insane not to regret that they didn't do more. And I certainly regret that I was unable to do more. In terms of education and job training, job skills, I think community colleges are the great unsung heroes in America. I would have liked to do more to help community colleges. Public higher education is critically important. I would have liked to, in the capacity of, I work very closely with the Secretary of Education, do more to help build and ensure that the costs of public higher education were affordable. They have become less and less affordable. I think overall, I would have liked to have left office with a much stronger labor movement than we now have. And I could go on.
Thank you. I would like to show a little clip from the movie, and I'll follow up with a question right after. Let's see the clip.
Look, the question is not inequality per se. The question is, when does inequality become a problem? How much inequality can we tolerate and still have an economy that's working for everyone and still have a democracy that's functioning?
Many of us professors
This is
have
actually
this
all I
problem.
have to wear.
A lot of us have this problem. Professor Reich, do you think the political process not working is a consequence of the inequality itself?
Yes, I do think that there's a high correlation between a democracy that's not working and widening inequality, because frankly, political power rises to the top when a lot of money and wealth rises to the top. We saw this in the late 19th century when the robber barons, the so-called robber barons, ran the country. The lackeys of the robber barons literally put sacks of cash right on the desks of pliant legislators. Although we do have some restrictions and hopefully more restrictions with regard to the influence of big money, it is very difficult to do anything as long as big money is undermining our democracy. So it seems to me, number one, not necessarily in this order, but number one in terms of importance, is getting big money out of our politics.
We have a question from the floor. Amrit Lal, please introduce yourself and your affiliation.
My name is Amrit Lal. I'm a student here. Dr. Reich, in view of the extreme political polarization, both inside and outside Congress, what can be done which is constitutionally and politically correct to reduce economic inequality?
Thank you.
Well, I think given the polarization, it's very hard to do much of anything, which comes back to why we made the film and why I think it's terribly important that people understand the issue. If they don't understand the issue, polarization is just going to continue because because when people are frustrated and angry, when they're working harder and harder and getting nowhere, they are very vulnerable to demagogues who will tell them that the problem is foreigners or immigrants, or they're not getting ahead because of the rich or the poor, or because of unions, or because of government. It's easy to find scapegoats. And the question really, it seems to me, is making sure that people understand the real sources of the problem so that we can have an intelligent discussion about it and therefore come to some important steps. Take the minimum wage, for example. I think the minimum wage around the nation, it's now $7.25 an hour nationally. The national minimum wage should be raised at least, in my view, to $10.40, $10.50 an hour, because if you took the minimum wage of what it was in 1968 and merely kept it constant, adjusted for inflation, that would be over $10.40 or 50 cents an hour. If you adjusted it for productivity improvements since the late 60s, it would be closer to $15 an hour. Now, are we going to get any kind of congressional action on the minimum wage? It seems to me that because something in the order of 65 to 85% of Americans, including by some polls, even a majority of Republicans, believe that the minimum wage should be increased, there is a possibility of that kind of action. The same thing with something called the Earned Income Tax Credit. Now, I just say that and eyes glaze over. I mean, if you want to put people to sleep, just say Earned Income Tax Credit and they go. But this is a kind of a reverse income tax. It's a wage supplement for low-income people. It's very important. There are a lot of Republicans who actually do support enlarging and expanding the Earned Income Tax Credit, which, after all, was the brainchild of a very conservative economist named Milton Friedman. So there is room for movement on these kinds of issues. On tax, I think we do need to close some large tax loopholes that favor the wealthy, so we have more money to invest in education and job skills and infrastructure. I don't think it's going to be possible for many people who want to hold on to those tax loopholes to justify them if the public understands what they are. Just to give you one example, and I know we have a limited amount of time, so I'm not going to bore you with a lot of examples, but just one that I feel is particularly outrageous. It's called the carried interest loophole, and it allows hedge fund managers and private equity managers to treat their income as capital gains and therefore qualified for a much lower level of taxation and rate of taxation than ordinary income, even though they have not, in most instances, invested a penny of their own or risked a penny of their own in terms of their investments. This has no justification. No one on either side of the aisle has ever been able to come up with a justification for this particular loophole for the wealthy. It's there solely because they have a lot of economic power and have made a lot of campaign contributions. But let me tell you something, that costs the Treasury about $12 to $15 billion a year, which is as much as we would need to expand extended unemployment insurance for all of the long-term unemployed in this country. If you understand it in those terms, do you want to provide a special tax loophole for hedge fund managers and private equity managers, or do you want to provide something for people who have been unemployed for more than 6 months and who have no income at all? I don't think it's much of a choice. people will see the obvious rationale of doing that.
Thank you, Professor Reich. We have another clip from the movie that we want to show you, and I have a question related to what you just said. Let's see that.
Look, the most important thing to understand is that consumer spending is 70% of the United States economy. And the middle class is the heart of that consumer spending. So it's your middle class that keeps the economy going. There's no way you can sustain the economy over the long term without a strong and vibrant and growing middle class. Can't be done.
This is a sort of out-of-body experience for me to see. But anyway, your question.
If you look at this clip, you suggest that one way to get around inequality is to increase consumer spending. I read your book. My question around this was that how does it fit in with the current environmental consciousness of conservation and reduced spending?
Well, there's a difference between consumerism, which we might define as just more acquisition of stuff on the one hand, and consumer spending, which can be on everything from education to healthcare to recreation to all sorts of environmental protection. In fact, public goods would be included in a larger definition of consumer demand. Public goods such as higher education. I think that right now it's absurd that we have so many students in higher education who are under the gigantic burden of student debt. We ought to regard our higher education, colleges and universities, as public goods, the same as we regard K through 12 education. It's a public good. We all benefit when more of us are educated. And so that too is part of consumer demand.
Okay. You mentioned minimum wage, and you managed to raise minimum wage when you were Secretary of Labor. And we have a question from a student from Missouri. If we could have that question. Julia Brooks from St. Louis University, Missouri, asked this question. So the question said, why did Obama administration choose $10.10 as the golden number to raise the minimum wage for federal contract workers? Why not 10.09, 10.11? What was the rationale behind
$10.10? Well, I think it had a kind of symmetry, 10.10. I really don't know. As I said, if you took the 1968 minimum wage and adjusted it for inflation, it would be closer to $10.40 an hour. I think that the Obama administration probably calculated that $10.10 might be a little bit more on the conservative side in terms of calculating that inflation-adjusted figure. And maybe they also counted votes and thought that maybe there was a possibility of getting $10.10 when you couldn't get maybe $10.40. I remember in 1996 when we tried to get a minimum wage increase. The minimum wage then was $4. It was $4 and I guess it was $4.65, and I was arguing for a higher minimum wage. And I argued for $5.25, and somebody said, well, why not $5.30? And I said, all right. Look, I mean, the minimum wage, the real issue here, it seems to me, is should we have a minimum wage?
Yes.
Some people argue that we should not have it at all, because inevitably, if you have any minimum wage, some people are going to not be employable. But the question fundamentally here, as with so many issues, is what is a decent society? How do you define a decent society? Do we have minimum standards for worker safety? Do we have minimum standards with regard to a minimum wage, a decent wage? Do we have minimum standards with regard to a 40-hour work week and time and a half for overtime, or any other workers' rights that we've developed over the last century? And I think the hallmark of a decent society is that somebody who is working full-time should not be in poverty, and their children should not be in poverty.
So on Tuesday, the Congressional Budget Office came out with a report saying there will be, they project job losses around 500,000. Do you agree with that? What are your thoughts on
Well,
that?
I think their methodology, we could have a very long and tortuous discussion about methodology. But the Congressional Budget Office also showed that an increase in the minimum wage to $10.10 an hour would lift many, many more multiples of people out of poverty. And I think that's the critical piece of information.
Okay. There's another clip that we wanted to show you, and this is coming up now.
It showed that there were two peak years. 1928 and 2007 become the peak years for income concentration, both of them in which the top 1% is taking on more than 23% of total income. This graph becomes very central for explaining what has happened to the U.S. economy, and indeed what's happening and has happened to our society. It looks like a suspension bridge. What happened the year after 1928? The Great Crash. And what happened just after 2007? Another crash. The parallels are breathtaking if you look at them carefully.
So we tend to learn from history, and we know that the New Deal happened right after the Great Depression. Why aren't we seeing similar legislations after the Great Recession?
Well, I think the irony here is that because of the stimulus package right after the almost meltdown of Wall Street, and also the bailout of Wall Street, which was terribly unpopular, nevertheless, the two together, bailing out Wall Street and stimulating the economy, avoided a second Great Depression, which is a good thing. I'm not suggesting that it isn't. It's a good thing. We would have had tremendous suffering. But ironically, by avoiding a Great Recession, another Great Depression rather, I should say, we avoided the political will to make fundamental changes in our economic structure, such as were made in the 1930s. So we saved, the Obama administration, I think, should be credited for preventing another Great Depression. But again, ironically, by doing so, it avoided and prevented the kind of political groundswell we needed to make the reforms that are necessary.
We have a question from a student. We have Paku's question, please, on the screen. It says, since inequality exists, what needs to be done in order to have equality for all? What can we do, and how can we do it effectively?
At the website, www.inequalityforall.com, we've included some of the most important things, it seems to me, to be included in any set of initiatives for overcoming widening inequality. Now remember, some inequality is inevitable and it's even necessary, presumably, if people are going to have adequate incentives to work hard and to invest and to innovate. But we've gone way, way overboard to the point where we are threatening our democracy and our economy. One thing we can do, we've talked about the minimum wage and the earned income tax credit. Another area has to do with a tax policy. We've talked about that a little bit, getting rid of some of the tax loopholes. Another has to do with education, making sure that education is affordable. And I know many of you are interested in that, and I'm happy to get into those details. Another area has to do with making sure that Wall Street doesn't go off the rails again. A sixth or fifth area has to do with making sure that labor unions, particularly in low-wage occupations, are allowed to function and represent their workers and bargain for better wages. We've also talked about getting big money out of politics. Well, again, there's no magic bullet, But in each of these silos, each of these areas, there are a number of very specific and important steps that can be taken. And I'm convinced will be taken eventually.
Well, talking about trade unions, let's get there. There's a question from a student from Alaska who says, I was wondering if you would discuss how American labor laws have become detrimental to unions over time.
Well, American labor laws used to be very clear and firm about the right of workers to collectively bargain, and the demand and requirement on employers to bargain in good faith. But those laws have not been adequately enforced, and the penalties on employers for not bargaining in good faith or intimidating their workers or harassing their workers have been almost treated as a cost of doing business by many employers. We are now down, just to give you an example, in the 1950s, over 35% of American workers in the private sector were unionized. Now, this meant that they had tremendous bargaining power to get a fair share of the gains of economic growth. Today, fewer than 7% of private sector workers are unionized. And when you have that little degree of bargaining power, it's very hard to move forward. Now, part of the problem with regard to unions has been obviously globalization, technological change. It's hard for unions to unionize when businesses can go to non-union states or non-union countries. But having said that, look at what happened just recently in Chattanooga, Tennessee. You had there a plant of a global automaker, Volkswagen, and the Volkswagen management did not oppose the union. The people who opposed the unions were the governor and the senator, one senator from that state, from Tennessee, and a local member, a member of Congress in the state legislature. They all said they didn't want the union to come in. The union lost the vote very narrowly. The labor laws really should be read, in my view, broadly enough to read what the politicians did as a form of harassment and intimidation and coercion.
And were you surprised? Were you surprised when this happened?
Was I surprised? Well, I wasn't surprised because people are very, very worried about their jobs all over this country. They are, unfortunately, easily intimidated. If you're a senator and your governor and major politicians say you are likely to lose your job if you vote for this union, well, if I'm desperate to hold on to my job, I may be scared. And I am not surprised that some workers were scared. But the latest news is that the labor representative of Volkswagen in Germany, representing the Workers' Council in Volkswagen, said that they are not going to, and they're going to work very hard to discourage any new investments by Volkswagen in the southern states in the United States until they are unionized.
We have a clip coming up, and this kind of ties into this. So, can we have the clip, please?
So who is taking care of the American worker? Who is looking out for the American worker? As GE and other big companies and Wall Street and the very wealthy, who basically have capital all over the world, as they have more and more political power, who is actually working in a way in Washington and in state capitals that improves the well-being of the American workforce? The answer is nobody.
What do you think?
That was sort of a downbeat. You know, when we made the film, Jake Kornbluth, who couldn't be here today, is the director of the film, wonderfully talented fellow. And when we made the film, he kind of sat behind the camera and asked me questions and got me to the point where I was really riled up about things. And that was an example of one I was riled up because, you see, I have a great deal of admiration for many people in Washington and many people who are who are trying their hardest to make the system work. But the fact of the matter is that American workers, the average worker in America, doesn't have, because of unions not being there for them, because politics is now so dominated by money, because American companies are becoming global companies doing so much of their work and so much of their sales abroad, because political parties have become essentially fundraising machines. The average worker doesn't have the structure around him to advance his or her causes for better jobs, better working conditions, more security, and is therefore very, very vulnerable. And I think that unless we understand that structural problem of vulnerability and powerlessness, we can't really make much progress. We've got to, and this goes back to something that I mentioned at the beginning, we've got to think of this shared prosperity, the goal of shared prosperity, as a movement no less important than the movement for the women's suffrage or the movement against child labor, the labor union movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement, the movement with regard to gay rights. This is rights. These are economic rights for average working people and everybody who wants to join the middle class, the poor as well. If we separate the poor from the middle class, we just are caving into the divide and conquer strategy that's been used for years by those who want to essentially keep people scared and keep people down. This has got to be a political movement.
There's a question from the audience. Christopher Fernandez, are you here? Can you ask your question, please?
Yeah. Hi, my name is Chris Fernandez. I'm a student here. My question deals with the concept of lobbying. In your movie, you actually said that this is an area where we can assign blame. My question for you is, what should be done about this issue? Can something like this be regulated? And what is to prevent lobbyists from fighting these regulations? Thank you.
Christopher, lobbying itself is not the problem. It's what the lobbyists promise. It's the bundling of money. It's the provision of money. It's the pollution of our democratic process by lobbyists who are representing either wealthy people or big corporations who are promising money in return for specific favors. And we can do something about that. Number one, we've got to reverse that shameful Supreme Court decision called Citizens United Against the Federal Election Commission. The next justice who leaves the court, either retiring or leaving the world, hopefully we're going to get justices that understand that corporations are not people and really not reflecting, unfortunately, another Supreme Court decision before that, that money is not speech. But even if we cannot get the Supreme Court changed, we've got to have a constitutional amendment to reverse Citizens United. Secondly, we can have, even after Citizens United, we can have public financing of general elections that provides, for example, $6 of public money for every dollar raised from a small donor. And I say small donor not in terms of height. We can also have full disclosure of every individual and every company providing money to advance or detract from a particular candidate. There is no excuse, in my view, for not having a full disclosure law on the books right now, today, and we can fight for this. And I think the American public will be behind this. In fact, all three of these provisions. Let me add one more. We have to stop the revolving door between government and the lobbyists and industry. The revolving door is revolving faster and faster and faster. In the 1970s, when I first got involved in American politics, only about 5 to 10% of members of Congress, when they retired Congress, went into lobbying firms. Now it's closer to 50%. There is no excuse for that, because how can you be truly representative of the people when you know you're going to be retiring and become a lobbyist for special interests?
Professor Reich, we have a question from Oladeji Tiamu from University of Toledo in Ohio. This is a very long question, but I'm going to quickly read through this. This came in this morning. The president has proposed the federal minimum wage. As noble as his actions are, isn't increasing the minimum wage a distraction from the underlying causes of economic inequalities? Would you argue that the primary difficulties facing the American working class is a massive skills gap that has been created as a byproduct of globalization? If so, would the debate on economic inequality be more productive if public discourse focused primarily on developing skills that are necessary in a globalized economy for the working class instead of simply increasing minimum wage?
Look, I'm all in favor of education and skills. As I said, one of the basic pillars of doing something about widening inequality is making higher education and a world-class technical education available to more young people. But having said that, let's be clear that that is necessary but not sufficient. We know that the wages of college graduates, adjusted for inflation, over the last 15 to 20 years have also been going almost nowhere. The typical median wage of the typical college graduate is not rising along with productivity. So we've got to look for deeper causes and make more fundamental structural reforms. Let me just make sure we're all together on this, because this is critically important. Up until between the end of the Second World War and the late 1970s, the median wage, and when I say median, you know that I'm not, the difference between median and average. The basketball player Shaquille O'Neal and I have an average height of 6'1". So do you know what I mean? You're getting, the people at the top bring up the average. When you're talking about median, we're talking about half above, half below. That median wage continued to rise corresponding to the rise in productivity up until the late 70s, and then the median wage started to level out. Why did we see the median wage starting to level out in the late 70s? Well, we understand now, we didn't then, that there were two great forces, globalization and technological change, that began to force companies and institutions and the stock market and everybody else to push wages down, because consumers and investors could get much better deals by going abroad or going to low-wage places around the country. That does not mean what we have to do is close the American market off or become neo-Luddites and smash all the new technology. No, other countries have continued to invest in education, invest in infrastructure, raise their median wages, have a more progressive income tax structure to be able to afford all of this, make sure that their financial systems didn't get out of control, threatening the well-being of most of the rest of the population. Other countries have, in short, made much greater efforts to respond to globalization and technological change than we have since the late 70s, early 1980s. And I think that's what gives me hope. Not only can it be done, but with the right set of policies, we will be able to do it.
A student of mine, an economics student, asked me this question. I said, absolutely, ask Professor Reich this question. Are you here, Jay? So he's going to ask you about new growth theory. Let me just tell you, just define new growth theory. It says that if profit incentive is great enough, people will choose to invest in human capital and look harder for new innovations, as this is the only way to grow profits when competition lowers profits in other areas. So he has a question around that.
Thank you, Dr. Chaudhary. So Professor Reich, of the many things, I fully agree with you when you state that the government must invest in education and infrastructure. Whilst you were expanding on these thoughts in your documentary, it made me think about new growth theory. If you were running today as Labor Secretary, what reforms would you propose in favor of this? Do you feel that the education system must be reformed and somewhat regulated because it might be corrupted in parallel to how lobbyists are corrupting the political system? that possibly it may not be the government failing in its responsibilities to the masses, but it might be the system in itself? Thank you.
Well, there's several things that we've got to do. With regard to higher education, number one, I would get rid of the student loan program altogether and substitute a different kind of system in which you would pay nothing as a student for higher education, but you would pay back into a fund 10% of your full-time salary for the first 10 years of full-time employment. So if you, for example, decided to become an investment banker, you would make major contributions into that fund. If you were a social worker, your contributions would be far less. The investment bankers would be subsidizing the social workers. That seems to me perfectly permissible. On K through 12 education, what worries me most is our fixation on tests. We do have to bring all children up to a minimum competency with regard to English and mathematics, and some testing is probably a good idea there, but we've gone way overboard. We are creating in our public schools test-taking factories where teachers are teaching to the test rather than teaching students to think. And in the future economy, it is not a standardized economy. All of the standardized jobs are being taken over by computers and software. What people have got to learn to do is to solve problems, identify problems, think outside the box, outside the standardized box, and work collaboratively with others. That is not taught on standardized tests, just the opposite. So I fear that by creating test-taking factories, we are doing a huge disservice to our young. Third, it is ridiculous to assume that the only gateway into a good job is through a 4-year college education. We've got to provide many more of our young people with world-class technical education, such as they have in Germany, so that you can use the last year of high school and maybe the first 2 years of college to master a domain of technical knowledge, enabling you to learn on the job thereafter. Those technician jobs pay well. There is a demand for them. We need, and the country needs, people who have those technical skills. Early childhood education is also absolutely critical.
So I'm going to put on my health economist hat at this point and ask you a question. I really liked your proposal for Medicare for all, and wouldn't we all want that? As Obamacare goes into effect, let's say people realize that these state-based health exchanges are not working, and we do go to Medicare for all, and sort of a federally run Medicare program. I foresee that the big companies will start dropping healthcare benefits. But in lieu of that, they'll have to increase wages, somewhat of an opposite of what happened post-World War II. Do you think that might help work this inequality out or improve wages?
Well, let's be clear. What we have now, the Affordable Care Act, is certainly better than nothing, and it's better than what we had before. But I tend to agree with you. I think we do have to move to, and I'm sure we will move, toward a single-payer system. It is more efficient, it is more necessary, and it is ultimately fairer. The state-based exchanges enable states upon the same model as Social Security and Medicare, that is financed by payroll taxes and available to all. Medicare for all, but in the spirit of compromise. The Obama administration adopted the Republican plan.
And went to the state-based.
And went to state-based exchanges. Yes.
And a federal exchange would have been perfect. Yes. I'm going to open the mic up from the floor for one more question. Please identify yourself and state the question briefly.
My name is Tim Carter. You talked about in your in the movie about technological productivity had the dual effect of increasing wealth while decreasing wages, and you talked about the need for consumer spending to be the engine of the economy, and one of your suggestions that you gave was an increase in the earned income credit, which was based on Milton Friedman's idea. But his idea was actually negative income tax, which would basically eliminate poverty, abolish poverty. And I was wondering if you would support the abolition, just the simple abolition of poverty through a basic income guarantee or a fully funded negative income tax.
Thank you.
Yes. No, I think it's an interesting point. That is, the original Friedmanite idea of a negative income tax really was provided as a way of eliminating poverty. And I think that we do need to seriously think, particularly as productivity increases, technological change provides us with great benefits, but requires fewer and fewer people to actually do the work. Robots are going to be doing more and more. We've got to seriously think about how we widen the circle of prosperity, how we get shared prosperity. Otherwise, who's going to be the customer? And a minimal guarantee with regard to income, it seems to me, is almost inevitable in terms of the direction that the structural changes of our economy are taking us in.
There were several questions that came in around this topic, and I took the liberty to summarize this. There are many international students that come to America, and we have so many international students on our campuses. When they come to America, they do see America as richer than most of their home countries. You provide prescriptions for elevating inequality within America, but what are your thoughts on America's role in helping or reduce global inequalities?
The United States, I think, does have a responsibility with regard to economic development around the world. At the very least, do no harm. And unfortunately, our agricultural subsidies and agricultural tariffs are doing a lot of harm. But they're making it harder for many developing countries to export their agricultural produce. At the same time, they are increasing food prices here in the United States. And the major beneficiaries are very large agribusinesses. So I would say, at the very least, let's do away with that.
Okay. Professor Reich, we just have 2 minutes to wrap up. Is there anything that you would like to say to these hundreds of students participating today?
Well, let me just say this. I am also a student of American history, and I know that if you look back in American history to the era that known as the Progressive Era, 1901 to about 1914, that immediately followed one of the largest periods of inequality we had in this country in the late 19th century, we see the resilience of this country, the ability of America, when we get off track, to save capitalism from its own excesses. We did it again in the 1930s. We did it to some extent in the 1960s, and a little bit when I was Secretary of Labor, a little bit. But we do have that resilience. When people understand the nature of a problem, they roll up their sleeves, put ideology aside, and get on with what needs to be done. This is not a zero-sum game, this inequality. Solving it does not require that the rich do worse in order that the poor and the middle class do better. In fact, the rich would do better with a smaller share of a rapidly growing economy, growing rapidly because there is more widespread prosperity, than they would do now and are doing now with a large share of an economy that is barely growing at all, and where we have deep polarization and anger and frustration and a politics that is quite poisoned. So I don't think this is going to be, well, it's not going to be easy, But I am absolutely convinced that we are going to succeed. And the success is going to come from all of you. What I said at the end of the movie, I feel quite sincerely, and I say this to my classes every year. I teach because I believe in you. I believe in your generation. I believe in your capacity to make a difference. I've and my generation have had it. We're leaving the stage. But you will make huge progress on this issue. You will reverse these troubling trends. You will widen prosperity. You will save our democracy. And you will also be a beacon light for the rest of the world. And for that, I thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for all of you for coming. We have some closing remarks. I have invited my good colleague and president of De Anza College, Dr. Brian Murphy, to come up here and just speak briefly to close our event. Thank you.
Thank you. Before all of you flee the room, these closing remarks are not in the form of some vague honorific. I want to call your attention to some very concrete, practical matters with which you can attend to this issue. This was being fed, this half hour and the film before it, to 250 community colleges and universities around the United States. The combined enrollment of those 250 institutions is a little under 3 million students. These are non-trivial numbers. The message in the film was fairly clear. If you will, the subtext, if one of the currencies of politics is currency, the other currency is votes. Votes require mobilization, campaigns require organizing. So the campaign that is implied in the film is then called out by Professor Reich multiple times, which is for us to take responsibility in each of our universities and community colleges, in each of our neighborhoods, our communities, our cities and towns, to address this issue in the very different ways it can be addressed in those different places and towns. The universities and community colleges that I mentioned are part of two national networks. They were mentioned almost in passing in the very beginning as the sponsors of this program. The American Democracy Project of the Association of American State Colleges and Universities, and the Democracy Commitment of the American Community Colleges. Those two networks, 242 universities and 136 community colleges, those two networks will be announcing this summer a national campaign to address inequality in the country at our campuses, through our networks, in our neighborhoods, with our allies and friends in our communities. So, I have some very practical places for you to go if you've got your pens or the pencils or you didn't yet put it away. The website for the film, inequalityforall.com, is the place you go first. Secondly, www.aascu or www.thedemocracycommitment.org will lead you then to notices regarding the national meeting of those two organizations in Louisville, June 5th, 6th, and 7th of this year, where the organizing of this work will begin. I close then on a very practical note, which is you've been asked to reflect individually about what you might do, and all of that will only matter if we do it together. Not alone, but together. Many of the people in this room are transfers from community colleges. Half of all of the graduates of this institution are transfers from community colleges. We are genuinely in this together. So, Professor Reich, we are in your debt for raising this call, for creating this wonderful film, and we then are in each other's debt to make it matter. Thank you.
As the credits roll, allow me to give special thanks to all the people who helped put this event together. First, to Dr. Reich, Professor Chalhori, to Professor Hamid Khani, Department Chair Scott Patterson, Michelle French, and the hardworking team of students from the Broadcast and Electronic Communication Arts Department, to Maggie Beers and Molly Ransom O'Neill, Robert Brendan from Academic Technology for the technical support, to Linda Green from CCS Presentations for providing the streaming, and to all of you for coming to this wonderful event. Take it home, talk about it some more, and watch for things to follow. Thank you all.